It's my pleasure to introduce B. Schlab Ridley, hope I've got that right, who built a passive house with her family 7 or 8 years ago now, and has been living there since then very happily. She's got a slide deck to show us and talk us through her experiences, and after that we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers to find out how she did it and how it's been living there. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to B, and we'll start her presentation.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Mark. Can I double check that everybody can see the presentation? Have the slides come up?
Yep.
Yes, I have, yes.
Excellent. Fantastic. So welcome to everybody also from me on these reflections on building and living in a passive house. So let me start by reflecting on what motivated us to embark on an eco build, which we did about 10 years ago. So from my side, I've been involved in sustainability professionally for quite a while. At that time, my focus was mainly bioenergy, and compared to the difficulty that we found in taking carbon out of liquid transport fuels, it was quite staggering that lowering the carbon footprint of buildings, particularly new builds, seemed comparatively easy. So we were keen as a family to practice what we preach and wanted to build our own place to high sustainability standards. So we first started looking for a plot actually already in 2002, at the point when we still had a flat in college. At that point, we didn't find any suitable plot and ended up buying a 70s house and renovating that as our starter home. But we hadn't quite given up on the self-build dream, and we were fortunate that in 2011 at a Cambridge Cleantech networking event, we met a company that was planning to build a small passive house development. So that sounded very interesting. We knew we needed more space. The family had expanded. And of the various versions of eco-build options, we were particularly interested in the passive house concept because of the mechanical ventilation and heat recovery, which filters out pollen from incoming air. My husband suffers from quite severe hay fever, so there was both an environmental benefit, but also a health benefit to be had. I should also say from the start that within that family context, we had a number of additional drivers, for example, ease of maintenance and low running costs. And particularly the former did not always sit quite so comfortably with all the eco features. So I declare up front, I'm sorry, this is not an eco purist project, but it's a story of finding workable compromises. So to cut a rather long story short, the company, which Integrity Buildings, they have sadly stopped trading a couple of years ago. They didn't find a suitable plot for a mini development, but they did find a single plot in a location very convenient for us. And so after quite a bit of hoo-ha, we finally managed to buy that plot and build our passive house. So let me share upfront some of the key features, and there's also more detail in the updated case study, which I trust you will have seen. We bought the plot in 2012, we moved in 2014. It was still a partial building site at that point. The last snagging and sign-off was then completed in 2015. I'll expand on the key features of a certified passive house in a minute, but the specifics to our place include that we are not connected to gas mains and have an all renewable electricity provider. So we do not need any fossil fuel to run the house. We've also been fortunate enough to get away without ever owning a car and have instead a cargo bike for transport and 2 e-bikes for longer distances. The house doesn't have any central heating, and compared to the place we lived in beforehand, we've almost been able to double the size of the house while halving the energy costs. So Passive House is essentially an energy consumption standard. It doesn't really say anything about the sustainability of the materials used. We were rather interested in the materials as well and tried to find a way to lock carbon up in the build itself wherever we could. So the house has a timber frame and timber walls. There was one T-steel bar necessary for structural reasons, and unfortunately the foundations required quite a bit of concrete and steel. But the wall cavities are insulated using warm cell, which is made from recycled newspaper. And for the roof, because of the space constraints, we had to use earth wool in its formaldehyde-free version. I had also worked with the regional water industry and have been quite shocked by the high carbon footprint of providing domestic drinking water. And with Cambridgeshire being a semi-arid region, not that you would notice at the moment, but it is a semi-arid region, we were rather keen to minimize drinking water use in our house as well. So we were lucky we had enough space in the garden to install an underground rainwater harvesting tank with sufficient capacity to flush the loos and water the garden as well. So only once so far during the prolonged drought in 2018 did the tank actually run empty, and we had to rely on the water mains for flushing the loos. So that's worked fairly well. So I've promised you a bit more background on what makes a passive house. Apologies to those of you who are well familiar with this concept, do bear with us. And I very gratefully acknowledge the Building Research Establishment as the source of most of the information in the next couple of slides. So what's a passive house? In principle, it uses the heating demand to a point where you don't need a traditional heating system. And the key features are very, very high degrees of insulation, minimizing thermal bridging, ideally getting rid of them altogether, providing an extremely airtight building envelope, and making sure that air quality is optimized through mechanical ventilation with heat recovery. The windows are triple glazed and are all large windows are south oriented to enable optimal solar gain, and the result is high thermal comfort. With regard to the looks, it doesn't actually need to look any different from any other house in terms of the numbers associated with these various features. The energy demand for space heating must be smaller than 15 kilowatt hours per square meter per year, and the overall primary energy demand of the house needs to be smaller than 120 kilowatt hours per square meter per year. As I mentioned, passive solar gain is a very significant factor, and so is high degree of insulation. So it needs to achieve a U value of smaller than 0.15 watts per square meter per Kelvin. And the triple glazed windows and also the doors need to have U values of smaller 0.8 watts per square meter per Kelvin. It's highly airtight, so the air leakage must be smaller than 0.6 times the volume of the whole house when you put it under 50 bars pressure for an hour. So the comparison that's always been made for our house, which has 160 square meter footprint, the volume of air that escapes within that hour under 50 Pascal pressure must not be more than the size of a watermelon. So heat recovery rate has to be higher than 75%. And this diagram just illustrates the key features of the passive house. So there is a very high level of insulation, minimal thermal bridging, triple glazing, and it also shows you the how the heat recovery works. So fresh air is being sucked in from the outside and filtered. In the ideal case, it is then passively cooled during summer and warmed during winter by running it through the soil. And In our case, that ended up not being possible. So this fresh air goes straight into the MVHR machine without that pre-cooling or passive pre-cooling or heating. The heat from the used air is sucked in. This schematic certainly does not show how our house works. In our place, it's sucked in from the kitchens and from the bathrooms. So the used air is sucked in, and then the heat is transferred onto the incoming fresh air, and the pre-warmed fresh air is then pumped into the living spaces, and the used cooled air is expelled to the outside. So this way you get fresh filtered air, but you keep the warmth generated both by the appliances and by the people in the house itself. So let me go back to telling you a little bit more about the journey of our house build. As I mentioned, we bought the plot of land in 2012. This was a very old orchard of about 20 by 40 meters with existing right-of-way for the neighbors, which you can see here. So that was grass for the right-of-way. The whole rest of the plot was a complete jungle. The plot came with a whole host of permitting issues attached to it. And they took quite a while to get sorted, but also were the reason for it actually being affordable for a family to buy a plot of that size. It came with outland planning permission for a 3-bedroom house, which you can see here in the middle. One of the conditions of planning was that nothing bigger than a 3-bed house was ever to be built on the plot. And it was a fairly small 3-bed house to start with, but planners very kindly allowed us to include the footprint of the conservatory into the whole footprint of the house. But we did have to stick very strictly to the positioning and to the height, and that's why in the final version here you can see the almost flat roof. And we also had to keep a double garage, slightly ironically, because we don't even have a car. But we were fortunate that the outline permission aligned the house pretty closely to the north-south axis, and that enabled us to have almost optimum solar gain for the large south-facing windows that you can see here. So first steps towards the build were then to clear the majority of the plot, retaining the trees on the west side, and to put the drainage in. And then we could prepare for the foundations to go in. Oops. We had to put 12 9-meter deep piles in because the groundwater level is very high in our area, and the soil contained a lot of root tissue which compacts and therefore collapses. And then the foundations themselves. The large concrete slab helps to provide thermal mass to this otherwise mainly timber building. So it stores the warmth in the winter and keeps the house more cool in the summer. So originally the plan was to go for a prefabricated house with a company from Austria, where they have lots of experience in building passive houses, but the carbon footprint of transporting such a house was certainly not ideal, and for a number of reasons this fell through. And we then decided to go for a partial offsite build for the timber frame, and then work with local companies to also expand the expertise base regionally of companies who have been involved in building passive houses and know how it's done. So the photo here on the left is at the site of Anson Timber in Suffolk, who did the prefabrication of these cassettes that make up the walls. And on the right, you see them having been delivered to our site and ready to go onto the foundations. And here, the ground floor walls are going up, leaving space for the south-facing windows. And on the right here, you can see the partitioning walls are going in, and the floor, the ceiling is going up. Here you can see the floor being installed upstairs, and the upstairs walls going up as well. And this is in the upstairs with the roof already on. And here on the left, before the OSB boards were fixed onto the walls and ceilings, and on the right afterwards. And that creates a 40 centimeter cavity into which the insulation material is blown. And you can see the holes here in these OSB boards. Those were drilled in so that this recycled newspaper warm cell insulation material could be blown into the cavities. And then the discs of OSB board were put back on, and the walls and ceilings were covered with airtight membrane. And I'll show that in the next slide. Here you can also see the windows ready to be put in. For the window frames, we went for wood on the inside and for coated aluminium on the outside. And again, the driver for that was to keep maintenance as low as possible, because you don't need to paint the aluminium outside every a few years. So here you see the windows installed from the outside, and here from the inside as well, and the airtight membrane. The blue tape here is used to stick the sheets of membrane together, and it's also used if there is a puncture anywhere to repair that puncture. And the airtight membrane is fixed onto the walls with these wooden batons, and on top of those then is the plaster boards are attached. And this 10 centimeter gap that is created by these wooden batons is quite an essential feature, because it prevents anybody later on by accident puncturing the airtight membrane if they put a screw or a nail into the wall. And actually one of the biggest learning curves for, I think, everybody involved in the build, compared, for all the trades compared to a usual build, was just to be mindful of that airtight membrane. Because when we did the first of these airtight tests, so basically that means you put a big blower into the main door, have everything else shut, and for 1 hour give that 50 Pascal pressure. And so the first airtight test failed. And then you have to go and find where is the hole. So it's been a very interesting learning experience for everybody, just to be, if there is something that happens, to be very upfront and open and honest about it, and say straight away, oops, my tool slipped, there is a hole now in the membrane. And then you can sort it out. So it's been an interesting learning experience of how to be mindful of these specific requirements of a passive house. But basically, once those plasterboards are up, you don't really see any difference between this house or any other house. Okay. So this now is one of the key features of a passive house, the mechanical ventilation and its heat recovery. And this is our utility room with the plasterboards all nicely up and painted. So just like any other house. And this schematic, again, you've seen before. As I mentioned, our fresh air comes in straight into the utility room. We don't have that extra loop. Unfortunately. The next feature that actually isn't related to passive house at all, but we were very keen on, is the rainwater harvesting tank that feeds the toilets and is also used for watering the garden. So here you see the installation schematic, and here the internal controls with the mains water backup. And you can see from the schematic that in principle, this system could also be used for washing machines, not only for toilets and garden, etc. And so this was one of the areas where we did end up compromising because there were concerns with regard to maintenance, you know, whether not using mains water would compromise the warranty for the appliance, etc. And yeah, so we ended up going just for the lavatories and for the garden. But in principle, the system could be used for washing machines. My brother's done it, and they do find that, you know, if the tank's running low, the laundry smells a bit funny when it comes out. So there's pros and cons. And yeah, in our case, that was one area of compromise. And as I mentioned before, we've only needed to have that mains water backup a single time in the very prolonged 2018 drought periods. However, the pump for the tank, we've had to repair twice. So overall, you know, there is some maintenance required for this kind of system we found. A key feature to control the solar gain from the south-facing windows are these external Venetian blinds. So in summer, we have them down continuously, basically, in this sort of arrangement with the slats being horizontal, which means you can see out without much obstruction, and light comes in quite nicely, but the windows are shaded. Because if you forget to do that, you will roast. The solar gain works extremely well. So there is an option to regulate this automatically, and you can just about see here the cluster of sensors that takes in the intensity of the sunshine and would automatically regulate the blinds going up and down. And we did that for a while, but we actually found that particularly if you have days with quite a bit of cloud cover, the blinds just go up and down unnecessarily. So we ended up just regulating manually, and that works perfectly well. So when preparing this talk, I was digging through some old presentations, and this is a list from a talk that was given at an event that we ran when the build was still going on. So these were the benefits that the completed house was to offer. And it's been quite interesting to reflect on this after 7 years of actually living in the house. So let me go through it in turn. The energy efficiency is certainly excellent. And as I mentioned before, our energy bills have reduced substantially, although the house is nearly twice as large as the one that we lived in before. Of course, it's still the same number of people living there, so there is some correlation. But yeah, certainly we find it that's a definite green tick. The red cross here next to the green cube isn't really related to Passivhaus performance as such, because this was a next generation MVHR system that was under development at the time when we were building, and we were meant to be the first installation of this novel type of MVHR. And the beauty of it was that in summer, the heat from the spent air would be transferred onto the water. So you'd have water heating built in automatically in the summer period for free, more or less. Sadly, that development fell through, and we ended up with a conventional MVHR and an electric water heater. And at that point, it was too large to switch to solar thermal for water heating or anything like that. So initially, that really annoyed me because, of course, electricity isn't the most efficient way to heat water. But given that we've been using renewable electricity providers from the start, at least it's been fossil energy free. And now where there is a push for moving to electric away from gas, etc., altogether, it seems quite acceptable. But at the time, I was not a happy bunny. With regard to high user comfort, that depends on how you define it. So in the very first winter when we moved in, we just depended on the system as they had been installed, and the temperatures did go down to about 14 degrees, which we considered not so comfortable. And at that point, we decided that we did need to invest into some additional point sources of heat. So we bought 3 small electric mobile radiators. The biggest one was 2.5 kilowatts, so that's about 50 centimeters in width. And that we have in the open plan downstairs. We have a 1.5 kilowatt mobile radiator, which is sort of 30 centimeters in width, upstairs in the office, and then a 500 watt, mini radiator mobile between the bedrooms and the guest room, wherever it might be needed. The bathrooms have heated towel rails, so they were okay. We use those on timer function and mostly on the very lowest setting in the depths of winter when the days are very short, and therefore solar gain is minimal, particularly if it's dreary days. As soon as the sun comes in, it is lovely, but without sun, you don't get solar gain. So we found the advantage of this over heating the house in winter through the MVHR system, which was the original intention as a little heater unit within the MVHR, which is meant to then circulate the heat across the whole house, was that we actually don't want the whole house to be the same temperature. I quite like my bedrooms cold and my office nicely warm. So by having these point sources of heat, which we control completely according to the rhythm that the family is in, that actually works much better than the uniformly distributed warmth that the original concept of the passive house was selling us as an advantage. But actually, I think the way that we've ended up with trial and error in our case works much better for us. And in the summer, if we were only to rely on the MVHR system to cool the house down, we didn't find that to work superbly efficiently either. The very simplest thing is just when on the cool periods of the day to open the windows and let natural circulation do the air exchange, and as long as it does cool down a little bit in the evenings, that works perfectly well. The drawback is that with this, of course, you're not filtering the pollen out continuously of the incoming air, and that was one of the things that we were rather keen on, and that's why in the first summer, we tried to keep the windows closed and do it through the MVHR, but we found actually opening the windows, it didn't make a big difference to the allergies, and it's quite enjoyable. When we first were thinking of doing a passive house build, this whole the thought of airtightness and of this mechanical ventilation, we were concerned, would it feel claustrophobic? Would you feel the draft of this ventilation system everywhere? And that's just not been an issue whatsoever. It just feels like a normal house, basically, where you want to make sure that in winter you keep the doors and windows closed as much as you possibly can, because otherwise you lose some of the advantages. But in summer, yeah, it's just that's not an issue at all. So accessibility for maintenance and servicing, that's been okay. The filters in the MVHR system that need changing every 6 months, but we can very easily do that ourselves. We've needed to aspirate some condensation water from the MVHR pipes above the bathroom earlier this year, but the guys from Eco East Anglia, who've installed the system and have also been great with all the servicing since, they managed to do that without too much trouble. The minimal acoustic values, again, it would slightly depend on how you define it. When the triple glazing is an amazing insulator also for sound, and when we first moved in, when the MVHR was not quite commissioned yet, it was amazingly quiet in the house. And in contrast to that, when the MVHR then was switched on, we could clearly hear the difference. And if the extraction levels are higher, then you hear it in the house now as well. But if it's on the everyday setting, then the extra noise is absolutely minimal. And the constant air exchange works a treat with getting rid of odors. So cooking smells do not linger in the house. And it's also very useful for humidity control in all the living areas. In our previous house, we had quite a bit of an issue with mold, because I wasn't so keen on keeping the windows open a lot in winter for air. I wanted to keep the heat in, but that was not so good for the mold. And that's been nicely absent from this place here altogether. In the bathroom, we do open the windows straight after taking a shower to help with getting rid of the first big sort of cloud of moisture. And with doing that, yeah, humidity has not been a problem. So I'd finally like to share a few lessons learned from the overall process that might be useful to some others as well. So mostly they are completely common sense, but I find it's never a bad idea to remind oneself of a common sense, and sometimes these things can take slightly different guises to what one had thought of first. I'll give a couple of examples. So first, aim high, but accept that you'll need to compromise. As I mentioned at the start, we had much grander plans initially, and we couldn't help that some things fell by the wayside in the process, be it because things weren't available, or the timescales just didn't work out, or the financial implications were not affordable, or that there were opposing drivers within the family prioritization, etc. For example, with the ease of maintenance that I mentioned beforehand. So, but by aiming high initially, at least it meant that the vast majority of the key sustainability features we could retain. Late changes in design, I mean, this is absolute common sense. They will drive up costs and may lead to unintended consequences, but it's so tempting to make those changes during the process. And sometimes, one can't do without it. But if you need to change things, just make sure you fully think through the breadth of potential consequences. And we'd had a couple of those, some initiated by our changes, some by the builder being very well-meaning, and then having unintended consequence of what in one way was an improvement turned out to be sort of a disadvantage elsewhere. So the fact, for example, that we have to open the windows in the bathroom to help with humidity control, that stems from us adjusting the position of the shower at a later stage when the extraction point from the MVHR was already installed above where the shower was meant to be. And the fact that now this extraction point is next to rather than directly above the shower means that the humidity just distributes itself much more in the room overall before it gets sucked out. And that means we have to we have to open the window a bit more. So that's just one example where something that made perfect sense at the time has some unintended consequences later on. And the third one, again, is absolute common sense, but not so easy to achieve and ever so important. That's communication, making sure that everybody sings from the same hymn sheet. And one example that caught us out was we were sent the electrical plans for review, and we did that meticulously and added comments to this PDF document all over the place to annotate what was to go where, and then emailed it all back. And next time we went onto the plot, we found that things weren't in the position that we had annotated. And it turned out that the electrician was using an iPad. And on the iPad, when you open the PDF, the comments didn't come through. So very frustrating, but just to be mindful of choosing the right tool of communication, as well as just constantly keeping up with each other. That can can help avoid a lot of unhelpful unintended consequences. So there's an awful lot more that I could say, but it might be best to focus the remaining time on those things that you're most interested in, and move to the Q&A session now. So I can't promise I'll have all the answers to the questions, but I will do my best to try to answer. Thank you.
Thank you, B, for a fascinating explanation and a journey through your story of building the passive house. I've got one or two questions, very simple ones, but perhaps we should defer to our audience. There's questions coming in on the chat feature, which you're all encouraged to type a question in, and then we can sort of feed them in to be one at a time. There's one from Nicole here about towel radiators. If Nicole, if you unmute yourself, would you like to ask it directly?
Hi B, thank you so much for sharing your plans. It's absolutely amazing project. It looks really, really impressive. I wanted to ask about heating. So other than the towel radiators, which you briefly mentioned, you said there's no central heating. So did you have any other heat source before you later decided to add the electric heaters? Did you consider underfloor heating, for example?
No, we sort of we quite believed the concept that you didn't need a centralized heating system, and so there is a backup option in the MVHR system itself. So there is a preheater when the air is too cold being sucked in from the inside, then there is a preheating step, and there's also a post heater after, which is meant to boost the temperatures further to a level that you set it at. So we could, in principle, have driven up the temperature through the MVHR system. So in the first winter, I don't think we quite understood how the system worked fully, and didn't play around with these factors too much. And only later on found out, yeah, actually there's more wiggle room that we could have explored with this, mini post heater system within the MVHR. But as I said, we didn't want the whole house to be the same temperature, and yeah, and even with those small electric heaters, the overall energy bills are very acceptable.
Very impressive, I think.
I mean, we do have a lot of, I put layers on in winter rather than cranking the heating up. You do notice it when we have our elderly relatives visiting, and they do like it warm. So when they come round, we have to crank the heating up, and I can go, whoof, I need a t-shirt, and they just feel comfortable. And that's of course not so helpful for the overall energy bills. But because we were quite surprised with COVID and home working, we thought the energy bills would go up. But when I checked in preparation for this talk, what was actually the difference between this year and last year, it was actually slightly lower, and I think it might have been because nobody was allowed to travel and we couldn't have our relatives here, and we didn't have prolonged weekends where it was swelteringly warm in the house over winter. At least that's my rationalization of that particular bit of data.
Excellent, thank you.
So there was never any plan to have any central heating other than a post heater on the MVHR, and
no.
and you basically don't use that, or minimally use it.
Minimally, yeah, and I guess it's also, there's 3 of us and we live in a 160 square meter house, so the passive house works better as a principle if it's slightly smaller houses or higher occupancy per square meter. We were very, huge luxury that we were able to have so much floor space, really. And because when the computer runs, that's a heating source. When you do a roast in the oven, that's a heating source, and whatever heat is being generated is kept very nicely within the house. So it does make a lot of sense if the heat can't escape. If you have things running, and people's body heat also contributes to it. Yeah, so if it's a smaller space, it works even better.
And you didn't mention anything about lighting in the presentation, did you?
Sorry. Yes, it's all LED lighting. You might see what I have in the ceiling there.
See something up above your head on the right hand side, yeah? Yeah. So it's LED lighting throughout. Okay, there's a question from Dennis about the rainwater harvesting. Do you want to come online, demute yourself, and come on and ask the question?
Yes, can you hear me? Yeah, all right, hello, Bea. Thank you for sharing your passive house experience with us. Very interesting. For the rainwater harvest system, is the water treated at all or filtered?
There is a filter before it goes into the tank itself, so that any debris doesn't go in. And you do certainly notice when when it's not rained for a while, and then there is quite heavy rainfall, the water is turbid. And I do have to remember to warn our guests who come for the first time before they go to the bathroom, just to say, I'm really sorry, it's it's not that the water is brown because it is rainwater. So it can and it does stain the ceramics much more quickly, so one has to be exert more mechanical force for cleaning, or also use slightly more aggressive chemicals from time to time. So that is a disadvantage. If it hasn't rained in a while and it's all nicely settled, the water's all clear. But just after turbulent rain, because the roofs that we have, it takes the water from the roof of the main house and from the double garage, and both of them are flat roofs more or less, and that makes that means that things settle on it slightly more as well. Yeah, so the turbidity doesn't get filtered out.
Any more questions from Dave or Dennis? Or
Thank you for your answer. That was very useful to know.
okay, and does it have a soak away at the end of the rainwater harvesting thing? What happens if the tank fills right up? Where does the water go then?
Oh, it has a fail safe, so there's a lot of drainage on the plot overall that was required. So that luckily hasn't been an issue either.
And you built the garage. I know you said you got permission for a double garage, but you don't have a car. Did you actually go ahead and build it? Well,
we had to. We weren't allowed to, because apparently, every 10 years or so, on average, houses change their occupants, and apparently these days, or at least 10 years ago, they thought that a 3-bedroom house needs two parking spaces. But because the roof is so flat, we don't have a loft, and the garage doubles up as a loft, more or less. Yeah, so we had to build a double garage.
And as a conservatory as well, or you said there was a conservatory on the plans?
Yes.
Where's
so
that?
the original house was smaller than what we have now, but it had a conservatory out the back, so we were allowed to include the footprint of the conservatory into the footprint of the whole house. Yeah, for a passive house, you don't really, well, a conservatory wouldn't fit within the passive house envelope, and it wouldn't really have added a lot of benefit, I think, for what we needed to use. But I don't think we would have necessarily been permitted to, gobble up the conservatory from the first plans and then add another one to it.
So basically, you built on top of it just became part of the footprint, and you built a story above it, and the house expanded.
Yes.
I see. And who was the designer? Who designed the house?
Well, we started off, as I said, in partnership with or in collaboration with an Austrian architects bureau, so there was they were experts in they've been built passive house for 20 years or so. So they were experts in the passive house concept. In terms of the design and layout, they were very collaborative with us, and basically my husband and I went through many iterations thinking how could this best work for us, and whatever was possible within the passive house concept they made possible. So one of the things that isn't possible is my husband originally thought, oh, it would be nice to have a whole glass wall or window wall, and that's not compatible with the passive house standard, because you could see with the U values, even the best triple glazing is still woefully worse than a normal solid wall, and therefore the size of the windows needed to be optimized for solar gain, but kept as small as possible, really, to avoid the heat loss elsewhere. So that was a compromise.
So what about those ingenious blinds you've got? You said you do them manually. Is that done indoors with a winder, or
Oh no, this is I think
electric operated? I have some demonstration. Here we are.
yes, that's the demonstration. So
You press the button.
Each room you can operate them from each room, and there's a master switch downstairs as well. So before we leave the house in the summer, and then you can adjust it to be in that horizontal position. So before we leave the house in the summer, we flip the master switch and it all goes down to make sure that it doesn't overheat.
Okay.
And then when you come back, you flip the master switch as well again, and it all goes up.
I see another question come in from John about again about the rainwater harvesting. Perhaps, John, would you like to unmute and pose your question?
Yeah, I was just curious. I didn't know whether 2 new pumps in 6 years was just unlucky, or whether you think there may be an issue with the pumps in the rainwater harvesting tank.
Well, I don't have a full answer to that. I guess that anything that is immersed in water is anything electric immersed in water is at higher risk. I think one of them may have been within warranty still. I should have checked that beforehand. But certainly my husband wasn't best pleased, because one of his key drivers was ease of maintenance. And in terms of, financial, saving costs of water bills, etc., the maintenance far outweighs any financial gain there. But this was an area that I was very, very keen on, because of the the work that I'd done beforehand. And it's just, I think it's dreadful that we use drinking water quality to flush the loos.
Couldn't agree more. So are they easy to maintain? Are they easy to get to, the pumps and stuff?
Not too bad, actually. It's a manhole cover just next to the bin store, and it's taken up quite easily to check that the filter is fine. And again, the guys from East Anglia have been very helpful in coming and checking things out and getting repaired for us. Yeah, so they did the MVHR and the rainwater harvesting system.
All right, thank you.
And they were operating under a different name then, but the key personnel is still at that new place, and they very helpfully kept the same mobile number. So when I rang saying, "Phil, can you help?" I said, "Yeah, I'm somewhere else now, but I can still help," which is extremely good.
Cool, thank you.
Great. Any thoughts, Chris?
There's one further question come in there about maintenance. I think you've almost touched on that already from Nicole. Could Nicole just put the last question?
Hi again, B. So in terms of maintenance, I mean, have you had to have professionals coming in to do various bits, or have you been able to do most of it yourself? So like the rainwater harvesting, obviously you've had people come in, but have there been other areas of maintenance that maybe were unexpected?
Well, the blinds need a bit of silicon spray TLC from time to time, because the spiders love nesting in the in those the guiding railings at the side. I was quite surprised how little debris actually was captured in the filters for the rainwater tank. So they don't need to be emptied very often, but that can easily be done by ourselves. The MVHR has 2 sets of filters, and those need changing every 6 months, but that's very, very simple to do. So we do that ourselves. And whenever we've had the guys from East Anglia come out to look at one thing, we've also asked them, could you just quickly check that everything else is doing okay? And with the electric water heater, there was a pressure thing that we hadn't realized needed sort of pumping up from time to time. So they did that and flushed the system out, etc. So it is advisable to have experts come in and just make sure things are shipshape from time to time. So we haven't actually, booked regular service it just happened, you know, at sensible intervals.
So who are Eco East Anglia? I've not heard of them before.
Yeah, so they used to be called Eco Living when we were when we built the house, and it's Phil Strickland is the person who's moved from one to the other. I think he's the co-owner. There are, I can put their website, Eco East Anglia, but I put it in the chat, and there you need to see a lovely photo of Phil. He's the guy on the left. Just a second. There we go. Yeah, so they do rainwater harvesting. They also do heat pumps, biomass, underfloor heating, solar PV, all the things that we didn't end up with, but heat recovery and ventilation and rainwater harvesting is part of their portfolio as well.
And where are they based? Obviously East Anglia somewhere.
Yeah, let me double check. Where was it?
Colchester. Someone says Colchester. That's very good. All right. Sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
In retrospect, if you were to do it all again from a blank canvas, what would you do differently next time? Or what would you do the same? I mean, you've covered the points you thought were successful and weren't, but if you had another go at it, how would it be different?
The prefab was a lovely idea, and I think I might see if it is possible to find something of that ilk without having all the transportation issues that would have arisen from the Austrian partners. That really helps to help you to plan the whole thing through before it actually gets built. And I think that's where, the changes later on is where cost goes up, time frames go to pot, and you end up with these unintended consequences. And if you've got a full prefab, then that doesn't happen. So I mean, that's a small thing, but certainly that's something I would
when you say prefab, was this one of these sort of dedicated Austro-German house building businesses that did the whole thing for you and brought it, like Balfritz had done in St Barnabas Road? And
something similar.
Yeah. Yes. And would they have done it in CLT or just I mean, how would they have built the house?
Well, it would have come in sections that fitted onto a lorry, basically.
Yeah.
But then, you transport air. It certainly isn't the most eco, the most, in terms of transport, is pretty horrendous trying to do that from the continent. If that was possible in the UK, I think that's something I'd be quite keen on. And of course, these days, technology has moved forward when we, we, again, not having actually, our own solar panels, because of the south-facing bit of this nearly flat roof, you could see is tiny, and it would have been eco bling, I think is the term, just to say I've got some solar panels when actually it didn't make an awful lot of sense. But if there was a possibility to actually have proper solar generation and storage as part of one's own house, I think that would be a nice thing to do. So the ideal would be to have an energy plus house,
Well, there's moved on a bit, isn't it? Just in the last 7 years,
yes.
What's possible has moved on a little bit, and we're doing one next week on my smart electric home, which people might be interested in seeing on the Cambridge Open Eco Homes website. But exploring all those sort of options. I guess that really wasn't an option in 2014, really, or it was certainly batteries weren't really around, were they?
No, it's certainly that wasn't at all developed yet. And 2014 is when we moved in, so the whole planning had to happen a couple of years earlier, and every month makes a difference in this field almost.
Mm-hmm. Could I just ask one more general question? I'm just wondering what's been the response of people in your network of friends and colleagues, and have they been inspired by what you've done, and are others thinking of taking up the same idea, or is it seen as something a one-off. You're pursuing your passion, and they haven't quite sort of identified it's something they want to do.
I think it does help to have examples. One of the biggest restrictions in the UK is the absence of building plots. We were so lucky, and I mentioned, we had 10 years earlier, we'd already started looking and looked for quite a while, and then gave up and just bought an existing house, because the system on the continent is certainly in Germany, where I'm from, as you can hear from my accent, is quite different. About half the new builds are self-builds, and there is, the infrastructure is set up for that. Whereas over here, it's a tiny percentage that does self-builds. So you don't get the plots, and then you don't have the say in how whatever is built newly is being created. So that's a big issue that people have found. I think with just the questions that have come with regard to rainwater harvesting, etc., it's things that you can do to an existing house that can be very helpful. And the fact that my brother had done rainwater harvesting, and I knew from him what worked and didn't work in their case, has helped us to be more, to take, I think, more informed decisions and feel less nervous about some aspects and mitigate against some of the negative effects that they had seen. So sharing information is always an extremely good thing. We've benefited from other people sharing their experiences with us as well.
Thank you.
Well, if there's no more questions from the floor, I think we might wrap up, because it's still a very visible Saturday afternoon. It's a really interesting talk, B, and I've really enjoyed listening to your presentation and working through all the nitty-gritty. That's what's so interesting about these talks, all the little nitty-gritty things which you don't really get from photographs. I mean, you need someone to explain what's going on in the background. Everybody's story is interesting. Yours is particularly interesting, and it's great to see that it's developing, and you've been there for 7 years and it's working out fine. You were, I think, the first certified passive house in Cambridge, I believe.
The first certified ones. I think others have built to passive house standard, but the certification, it costs a bit more, so not everybody necessarily feels it's
there are now several houses, and there's a huge development at King's College, isn't passive house standards, and Lucy Cavendish are building a student block to passive. It's really, and the city council said that in the future all the social housing will be passive house. So it's great to see how passive houses come in, from being a sort of little niche eco, cell to gradually extending its, because it's logic, isn't it? It's all good building physics, and it makes perfect sense to build this way, and it's great to see gradually catching on and more mainstream. And I hope people have enjoyed the digging down into the detail of what makes it a passive house. And with that, any last comments? I think we'll probably wrap up and leave it with you, B. Any last final word? Or
the only last thing that I think I may have forgotten to mention is we have very thick walls because we had enough space to use insulation material that maybe didn't have quite the same U values, but was both environmentally sound and quite nicely affordable as well. So you don't have to have, our walls are 60 centimeters now. You don't have to have 60 centimeters walls to achieve passive house standard. It can be done with a retrofit. It's just different insulation materials that have to be chosen then, which cost a little bit more, but take less space. I think that's the only one. And then the other thing is this, the end slides. Should I share my screen again, Chris? Are you going to talk to those?
I think Mark is going to just mention that, yes.
Do you want me to share my screen again?
Yes, please.
The open eco home slides. Yes, we're finishing up with a little bit of information about open eco homes. I see a number of people have signed out, but if you can give us feedback, you can have, presumably that isn't a live link, is it? Can you?
The link is in the chat, Chris.
It's in the chat. Yes, it's in the chat. We'd very much like to get some feedback. Cambridge Carbon Footprint, which runs Cambridge Open Eco Homes, is a charity. This is all done on volunteer work. Everyone's putting their time in for nothing. If you want to donate, we used to have a £5 donation for Open Eco Homes. Please do feel free to do that support. And there's one more slide, I believe.
Yes. Sorry. I have two screens going, so yeah.
Yes, as I mentioned, the one on smart electric homes is coming up next week. I'm also doing one for Wookie's amazing retrofit, which is in 2 Saturdays' time. And there's lots of things on it. It's an amazing program, and do dip into it and find out all the other things going on. We just had a really good talk from ACAN about architects declare about trying to get people to use more and more low embodied materials to do their building site. And there's a site to have a look at. Google households declare and find out about that. Maybe put a bit of pressure on the politicians before COP26. I think with that, we'll say thank you very much, and do come to some other talks. Thanks.
Just mention that there will be circulation of the set of slides by email in a few days' time. So if you want to look back at what's been said today, there will be that opportunity that will come round to your email in a few days' time.
Great. Thank you.